Dan Kovalik is here, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. If you might have seen this gentleman on RT, we got to meet him in Nicaragua. He's an awesome journalist, does amazing work for foreign policy. He's all over the place. Go and follow his Twitter before it gets taken down. Because, Dan, the way this Twitter's going right now, it looks like you might get taken down. You keep speaking about Nicaragua or Ukraine or anywhere else. How you doing today, brother?
I'm good. Thanks a lot for having me on the show. I'm really excited.
We're excited to have you on too as well because you're a person who kind of covers the globe, right? You know, I said today I wanted to talk about some stuff what's going on in Nicaragua because we'll obviously be there for the inauguration coming up and we witnessed the elections. But I also wanted to get your opinions on Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia in air quotes crisis. I don't think it's anything of a crisis. I think it's a lot more noise coming on from the mainstream media. But if you look at the New York Times, you saw the other day, it says Putin warns Biden of complete rupture of U.S.-Russia relationship over the Ukraine. And it said President Vladimir Putin of Russia spoke with President Joe Biden for 50 minutes. They had the conversation about the escalating crisis in Ukraine, but his intentions remained unclear. I love the way they always kind of frame the opposition or, another country as the boogeyman. And then they have a picture of, Biden coming down, looking all military-wise, off the plane. President Biden spoke with Vladimir Putin, Russia, by phone Thursday regarding the situation of the Ukrainian border where Russia has massed 100,000 troops by that border. Now, Dan, I would like to remind our audience that this is Russian troops being moved around Russia. That's right. The crazy part about this
within their border. It would be as if the U.S. had troops at their border in Texas, right, or in Arizona. Yes, on the Mexican border, but within the United States, right?
Yes, I know. It's crazy. So, playing on that, why don't you explain the macro of what's really going on the border? Because I watched MSNBC the other day for like an hour and a half. God bless me. It was Rachel Maddow's show, but she wasn't there. And if you would listen, and this is supposed to be the left media, they're so anti-Russia, it's ridiculous. Why don't you give us a little kind of macro of what's really happening at the Ukraine-Russia border?
So first of all, you have to go back to 2014. There was a coup in Ukraine, and we know this from statements that were made by various U.S. officials, including Victoria Nuland, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time. She's now in the Biden administration. And statements they made it clear that they backed this coup, and in fact that they manipulated it in a number of ways to make sure that the people they wanted got into power in 2014. What we also know is that some of the people who got into power are neo-Nazis, and there is a significant number of neo-Nazis, particularly in military units of the official Ukrainian government in Kiev. In fact, the former president, the beloved former president of Uruguay, Pepe Mujica, said it's not even fair to call them neo-Nazis because these are really guys who, draw their lineage directly back to the 1920s. These are just straight up Nazis.
Yeah.
And they very quickly started calling for the ethnic cleansing of Ukraine, of both ethnic Russians and Jews, as Nazis would do. And they have, in fact, carried out a war against the eastern part of Ukraine to carry out this ethnic cleansing. And it's a low-intensity conflict, but it continues to this day. There are, Kiev shells the eastern part of its own country. And many have died. Many have starved. The most dramatic action was in Odessa, where a union building was burned to the ground by neo-Nazis and killing scores of people within. Again, something that is not discussed in the West. And what has happened as a result of this is that many, when I say many, I mean tens of thousands, I believe hundreds of thousands of ethnic Russians have fled the eastern part of Ukraine into Russia. And so this has impacted Russia. It would be as if again, we have to analogize because, as Putin has said, what if we had troops in Mexico? What if we had missiles in Mexico? Because NATO does have troops in Ukraine. NATO does have missiles in Poland, okay, right near Russia. So this is not a silly scenario. So it would be as if the government in Mexico had neo-Nazi elements and they were attacking their own people in the north of Mexico on the border of the United States, and hundreds of thousands of Mexicans were fleeing into the U.S. as a result. You better believe the U.S. would be incredibly concerned about this, would also be amassing troops at the border, and would be very concerned about the fact that in this case, it was ethnic Americans, if you will, who were being attacked, right? This is what Russia's facing. Ethnic Russians are being attacked. And by the way, as the late, great Stephen F. Cohen pointed out, one of the great Russian historians, Sovietologist, he said, look, if Putin wanted to access the eastern part of Ukraine, he could have done it already. It would not have been a hard thing to do. And many of the ethnic Russians would like him to do that to protect them. He has so far not shown a willingness or desire to do this, despite the claims that his so-called amassing of troops at his own border is evidence of this. But Putin has a real problem. I mean, he does have this humanitarian crisis, and it is a real one, at his border. It is a crisis that the West helped create through this coup in 2014. And so this is where we're at. And, neither the U.S. government nor the mainstream media has owned up to this reality of what is happening in the eastern part of Ukraine, which could actually be described not only as ethnic cleansing, but even a genocide against the Russian nationals.
So in your opinion, what is the best and worst case scenario that could possibly come out of this situation?
Well, I mean, the best scenario is that the Minsk agreements, which everyone agreed to, are actually followed. And that would de-escalate the situation. It would allow for a certain level of sovereignty in the eastern part of Ukraine. And everyone would be happy, except I guess Kiev has decided they don't want to follow the Minsk agreements, and the West is not requiring them to. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that there will be a conflict in Ukraine that draws in the major powers, Russia and NATO, and that this could result in World War III. That is the worst case scenario. This is the scenario that sensible people have been warning about for years. And, sensible, reasonable people would say the way to de-escalate this is for NATO to draw back from Russia's borders, to stop threatening Russia, to take troops out of Ukraine. That is the way to do this, not to constantly, rattle our sabers at Russia. And by the way, we have to go back, if you would allow me to, a little further than even 2014. I mean, we really have to go back to 1989, when Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last premier of the Soviet Union, agreed to allow the East Bloc to move away from the Soviet Union and for the Berlin Wall to be taken down. And he agreed on one major condition, that NATO would never move an inch east of Germany. And that promise was made by Secretary of State James Baker. We know this. This is documented. And no sooner was that promise made and the Berlin Wall taken down and Germany reunified that NATO began to move east aggressively, now all the way to Russia's borders. And so if people are concerned about world peace, and they're concerned, frankly, about real diplomacy in foreign relations, they would have to be honest about the fact that it is the West that has broken the peace. between the West and Russia. Russia wanted desperately to be part of the West. Putin wanted to be part of the West. He's made that very clear. And the West said, we don't want you part of us, and we want to threaten you, and we consider you a threat, even though the Soviet Union's gone. Even though oftentimes you'll hear discourse that sounds like the Soviet Union's still there. In fact, sometimes you'll hear people slip up and call Russia the Soviet Union, right? And so this has been utterly baffling to Putin and Russia, as it should be. And the media has been complicit in this because they really have not given this full picture of what's happened and how things have broken down.
And just for clarification for the audience, I just wanted to say the Minsk Agreement was this protocol that sought to end the end of the war in the Donbass region, correct?
Right. And there's another region too. It begins with an L and I'm forgetting it. There's two different areas there, which now actually consider themselves separate republics. And actually, they have named themselves in a way that sounds like old Soviet republics, and they have some sympathy towards the old Soviet Union. But that's them. They wanted to do that. And that's the other thing that has been misportrayed, is that somehow Putin and Russia have instigated this, when they haven't. It's been the ethnic Russians who have done that in response to the fact that the government in Kiev since 2014 has declared war on ethnic Russians within Ukraine. Even one of the first things the new government in Kiev did in 2014, in fact, was to outlaw the Russian language as a second language. And so, obviously, if you're an ethnic Russian in the eastern part of Ukraine, you're going to feel under attack only because you happen to be under attack. And so, those two areas have declared themselves their own republics.
Yeah, and even though Putin wants to join the West, I don't think the military-industrial complex would ever allow that, Dan. They need a big bad wolf, therefore they can get their money, buy weapons, sell weapons, do what they need to do. And, I also just want to say ditto on 2014 as well, because it was a coup. It wasn't a revolution. And, you mentioned Victoria Nuland. Remember, she got the attaboy thumbs up from Joe Biden, who's now the president. And as soon as he got back in office, all the Warhawks, the Sullivans, the Blinkens, they came right out of the blue and started being aggressive towards Russia. But I want to ask you about your opinions about Zelensky, because I think it's really important, because at the end of the day, the real victims here are the people of Ukraine, right? They're the victims in all this, as Russia and the United States are supposedly going back and forth. Do you see Zelensky as a puppet of the West, or more of just a Ukrainian citizen that's just way in over his head, that's just trying to do anything to find some form of progress in Ukraine for his people?
I certainly see him as doing the bidding of the West and being a surrogate of the West in Ukraine. And that was the whole idea behind this coup in 2014, was to try to check Russia's influence by bringing Ukraine into the sphere of the West. And by the way, NATO's gone so far as to make NATO or Ukraine a partner of NATO, not a formal member, but a partner, which it was a huge threat to Russia, as you can imagine. And so it's not even like a secret. Ukraine is now constituted, with the government they have in Kiev. They have a loose partnership with NATO. So they are formally part of the West now.
Ma'am?
Did we? Oh, sorry. I thought he got cut off. Okay.
Nope.
Okay. I wanted to go ahead and move on to Nicaragua, because I believe you pretty much answered all the questions regarding Russia. But I really wanted to focus in on that, because we're leaving in a few days to go back. And the Renacer Act, the U.S. pretty much condemned the Nicaraguan elections as fraudulent. The mainstream media was talking about the elections being completely not valid, while simultaneously a lot of independent media was there to pretty much dispel those notions. You witnessed Nicaragua's elections. Does the U.S. have the right to wag their finger at Nicaragua or at anybody in the global South?
Yeah, the answer obviously is no. I mean, first of all, we have to start from the premise that, as Jimmy Carter said a few years ago, the U.S. itself is not a functioning democracy. We have a lot of problems with our democratic system, which are quite obvious. We can get into those, but that is just the truth. But also, when we look at Nicaragua, we have to remember the past, right? Americans are not good at knowing history to begin with, or if they did know it, they forgot about it. And we have to remember that the U.S. supported a brutal dictator in Anastasio Somoza and his child and grandchild from 1934 to 1979, when the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown by Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas. It was Ortega and the Sandinistas that brought democracy to Nicaragua and held the first free and fair elections in Nicaragua in 1984. They held them again in 1990. They lost and they stepped aside.
Yeah.
And they were not reelected until 2006, and they have been in power through elections since that time. They are the democratic force in Nicaragua, not the U.S. that supported dictatorship. And that, by the way, once the Somoza dictatorship was defeated, the U.S. quickly began supporting Somoza's National Guardsmen in the form of the Contras to try to overthrow the Sandinistas and to reestablish what they called Somocismo without Somoza.
Just as a follow-up real quick, what do you say to the people that say, well, Daniel Ortega has been in power for too long? Why is he the only one that gets to be in power? Because that's a lot of the criticism you hear from people who are more leaning towards neoliberal or Democrats,
Well, first of all, I think he's been in power this round for about as long as Angela Merkel was in Germany, or Bibi Netanyahu was in Israel. So, so first of all, it's a total double standard, but also he's been in power because of elections, because the people want him to. And in these elections that we witnessed, 65% of the Nicaraguans voted and 75% voted for him. I mean, he has a clear mandate. And in fact, recent polls show that the Nicaraguan people, by a huge percentage, have faith in their own government, have faith in their own elections, much more than Americans do in theirs. If you show those numbers, it's pathetically small, the number of Americans. I think it's around 30% or something that have faith in the U.S. elections and government and Congress. In fact, I saw at one point, it was so bad that more people in the U.S. supported a communist takeover of the U.S. than supported the U.S. Congress. I mean, there's very little support for our government. There's a lot for the Nicaraguan government amongst the Nicaraguan people, and there should be, because of all the things the Nicaraguan government has done for its people, and in terms of education, building housing for the poor. Again, democratizing Nicaragua, building infrastructure that had not been built by Somoza, that had not been built by the neoliberal governments from 1990 to 2007. I'll give you another example, which will shock most people. 3 years in a row, the UN ranked Nicaragua as number 5 in the world for gender equality. The first 4 were Scandinavian countries, okay, which you would expect. And then 5 was Nicaragua. And then the U.S. didn't even make the top 10. So the advances the Sandinistas have made have been incredible, despite U.S., again, support for dictatorship, the U.S. support for the Contras, embargoes, blockades, sanctions. What the Sandinistas have accomplished has been incredible, and they get very little credit for that.
I think Daniel Ortega building a lot of those schools we got to witness are awesome too as well. And that's why the people love him so much. It's poor people, what I'm saying? They were able to get their kids education. And I think that's something amazing. You did mention, Dan, infrastructure. My next question is that Nicaragua has now recognized Taiwan as being part of China. In other words, they recognize the one state. That means business will be done with China. What role will China play in the development in Nicaragua moving forward?
it's going to be an incredible thing. I mean, first of all, China's already helped a bit, but now they're going to be building hopefully train systems. By the way, that Nicaragua had a train system. I didn't even know this till recently, which Violeta Chamorro, the U.S. Sponsored president, who was elected under, a gun pointed the U.S. to the Nicaraguan people's head in 1990. She got rid of a train system they had. I didn't even know they had one. China will rebuild that. China may end up helping build the canal that the U.S. has coveted for over a century. It's one of the big reasons the U.S. has intervened in Nicaragua the way it has. As you know, Nicaragua is a giant lake in the middle of it. If you cut through that, you can cut from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and it would be a much bigger canal than the Panama Canal, which now is obsolete. The size of ships that exist today can't get through there. The canal that would be in Nicaragua could be big enough not only to allow the big ships to go through, but to possibly allow two to go through in different directions at the same time. And so this could be huge for Nicaragua, for its economy, and for Central America in general. And this is what the U.S. has feared for so long, that someone else would help build that canal, but that may be what happens. And it never had to be that way. It never had to be that way. Nicaragua culturally is much closer to the U.S. than China, right? They love baseball, for example, which is imported from the United States. I mean, they have a simpatico with the U.S., but the U.S. blew it, by its aggression against that country, and now it had to turn to China. And the U.S. has no one to blame but themselves.
So the Renaissance Act doesn't specify what areas the U.S. will sanction. Nicaragua is 95% food efficient. I mean, there's a lot of self-sufficiency in Nicaragua, which is one of the reasons why they've managed to, fight back against U.S. hegemony. What area do you think is most vulnerable in Nicaragua, and how do you think they're going to counter any sort of U.S. aggression this time around?
The big thing they want to do is cut Nicaragua off from international financing, from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, from other financial institutions, which Nicaragua has used funding from those sources to do a lot of poverty alleviation, as even the World Bank has commended Nicaragua for doing. But I think, truthfully, Nicaragua's economy is so small that they are going to be able to substitute those sources with China, with Russia, with Iran. They will be able to overcome these sanctions, and that will drive the U.S. crazy. But again, this was a necessary, an inevitable move that Nicaragua will have to make.
Last question, Dan, we'll get you out of here. On the right in America, obviously we saw the way Donald Trump acted towards the global South, putting people in charge like Lord Bolton and Elliot Abramson. You got the three most popular Republicans underneath him, DeSantis, Cruz, Rubio. They're all anti-Nicaragua. They are all for regime change. And the left ain't that far behind. I mean, Joe Biden called these elections pantomime and a sham. Do you see any chance for peace moving forward with the United States and Nicaragua? Is there any avenue that you might see that we can exploit to really see the truth about what's going on in Nicaragua? Because the mainstream media paints a very negative light on Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas.
And not just the mainstream media. I mean, much of the left has abandoned Nicaragua. Yeah. Democracy Now!, for example, is awful on Nicaragua.
Terrible.
Just terrible. In fact, I did a big tweet about that over the weekend. It got over 80,000 hits. I mean, because people know this. They understand that, right? I think it's going to be very hard because really, I think the two countries maybe three countries that are the most misportrayed and misunderstood in the U.S. because of the mainstream media are Nicaragua, Syria, and Ukraine. And I think there's very few friends of Nicaragua in this country. Sadly, it's obviously our job to try to make them new friends and to show solidarity with them. But we got a lot of work to do. I think the the propaganda has worked and has moved a lot of people who supported Nicaragua away from Nicaragua. And that's why what we're doing, going there for the inauguration, is very important to do.
And
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. I'd love to come back. Thank you. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, we'll see you this week, buddy.
Okay. Thank you. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Dan Kovalik, ladies and gentlemen. He's an awesome, awesome journalist. Go check out his Twitter.